I used to think my fiancé Mark was the architect of his own success. I spent 10 years in the shadows editing his speeches, fixing his balance sheets, and polishing his reputation until it gleamed. We were a team or so, I thought, but everything shattered with one simple, calm question. Mark, why isn't my name on the guest list for your birthday gala? I expected a laugh or a clumsy apology. Instead, I got a monster. Mark didn't just snap. He exploded. With a face contorted by a cruelty I'd never seen, he spat out the words that would end us. You aren't worthy of showing up, Sam. You're the help. You stay behind the curtain where you belong. In that moment of freezing humiliation, I didn't cry. I walked away. But as the music started at his glittering party, a woman wearing my favorite color and the jewelry I'd helped him pick out stepped into my place. She wasn't just his date. She was the face of a massive financial fraud he'd been building using my name as the shield. He thought he'd finally erased me, but he forgot one thing. I'm the one who knows where every body is buried because I'm the one who dug the holes. Tonight, you're going to witness how a woman's silence can become a man's death knell. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Mark didn't just lose his fiancée. He lost his career, his freedom, and the very world he claimed I wasn't worthy of. Stick around because the way I dismantled his life piece by piece is a lesson in why you should never betray the person who knows your every secret. My name is Sam, a 36-year-old senior copywriter who spent the better part of a decade believing that true power didn't need a spotlight. I have always been the woman behind the curtain, the one who turns raw ambition into polished success, and for 7 of those years, I poured every ounce of my professional brilliance into my fiancé, Mark. I wasn't just the woman he came home to. I was the architect of the man the world saw. I remember the evening with a clarity that still chills me. It started as a typical Tuesday in our upscale suburban home, the kind of quiet evening I used to cherish as the reward for our frantic professional lives. I was sitting at the mahogany desk in our library, the same desk where I had spent countless nights ghostwriting Mark's keynote speeches and refining his corporate strategy. I had just finished smoothing out the rough edges of a proposal that would likely net him a multi-million-dollar partnership, and I felt that familiar glow of pride. We were a team. I was the engine, and he was the sleek, polished exterior. Mark was in the kitchen pouring a glass of expensive bourbon, his silhouette framed by the modern cold lighting he insisted on during our last renovation. As I began closing out the tabs on his laptop to prep for the next day, I saw the final guest list for his 35th birthday gala, a high-stakes event at the Pierre Hotel, meant to celebrate his recent promotion to senior vice president. I scrolled through the names of senators, venture capitalists, and industry titans waiting to see my name at the top of the list, perhaps next to a note about our upcoming wedding date, but my name wasn't there. I scrolled again slower this time. I checked the reserved section and the VIP tables. Nothing. I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest, not of anger, but of simple, logical confusion. I walked into the kitchen, the soft clicking of my heels on the marble floor, the only sound in the room. I didn't approach him with an accusation. I approached him as a partner who assumed there had been a clerical error. I asked him quite calmly why I wasn't on the list for the gala. I even joked that the event planner must be losing their mind. Mark didn't laugh. He didn't even turn around. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon, and when he finally faced me, the warmth I had lived with for 7 years had vanished. It was as if a mask had slipped, revealing a stranger who found my presence irritating. He told me with a voice as cold as the ice in his glass that this event was about branding. He looked me up and down, eyes lingering on my comfortable sweater and the reading glasses perched on my head, and said that I didn't fit the aesthetic of the circle he was now moving into. He claimed that the evening required a certain level of social currency that I didn't possess. When I reminded him that I was the one who wrote the very words he would be speaking that night, he let out a sharp, mocking bark of a laugh. He told me that being a backroom editor didn't qualify me for a seat at the table with the elite. It was a classic case of gaslighting. He tried to make me feel small, as if my lack of desire for the spotlight was a flaw rather than a choice. He spoke to me like a disgruntled employer speaking to a low-level staffer who had overstepped her bounds. He told me I was being emotional and unprofessional for bringing it up. In his eyes, I was no longer his partner. I was a utility tool that had served its purpose in the workshop and was now being shoved into a dark drawer so the guests wouldn't see the grease on my hands. In that moment of profound betrayal, something shifted inside me. The tears that usually would have stung my eyes didn't come. Instead, a terrifyingly sharp clarity took hold. I stood there watching him adjust his silk tie in the reflection of the microwave, and I realized this wasn't a mistake or a moment of stress. This was a calculated social execution. He had spent months using my intellect to climb a ladder, and now that he reached the top, he was trying to kick me off so no one would know how he got there. I saw the boundary he had drawn between us, a thick, invisible line that relegated me to the shadows of our own life. While I had been busy building our world block by painstaking block, he had been using those same blocks to build a wall meant to keep me out. He wanted a ghost, a silent partner who would pay the bills and fix his mistakes without ever demanding a seat at the table. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I simply nodded, apologized for the misunderstanding, and walked back to the library. He thought he had won. He thought I had accepted my place in the background. But as I sat back down at the computer, I didn't open his speech. Instead, I opened our private banking portal and the corporate filings I had helped him submit. If I was just the help, then it was time to conduct a thorough audit of the master's house. I didn't know it then, but that question wasn't inappropriate. It was inconvenient. The morning of the gala, the house felt like a tomb. I watched Mark leave in a tuxedo I had meticulously chosen for him 3 months ago, his demeanor brisk and professional as if he were heading to a board meeting rather than the social event of the year. He didn't kiss me goodbye. He didn't even look me in the eye. He just adjusted his cufflinks, the silver ones I gave him for our 5th anniversary, and vanished into the waiting black car. I stayed behind, wrapped in a silk robe, clutching a cup of tea that had gone cold hours ago. I didn't cry. Instead, I opened my laptop. My dignity wouldn't allow me to crash the gates of the Pierre Hotel, but my curiosity demanded a seat in the front row. I spent the evening as a digital ghost hovering over the social media feeds of the city's elite, watching the spectacle unfold in real time. It wasn't long before the first images began to populate the Explore pages and the stories of mutual acquaintances. At first, I looked for Mark, expecting to see him standing alone, perhaps looking slightly out of place without his usual shadow. But when I found the first clear photo, my breath hitched in a way that had nothing to do with heartbreak and everything to do with a profound sense of violation. Mark wasn't alone. Standing at his side was a woman in her late 20s, radiant in a champagne-colored gown that was an exact replica of a design I had once shown him as my dream wedding dress. She was beautiful, certainly, but it was her posture that unsettled me. She was standing exactly 3 inches behind his left shoulder, tilting her head at the precise angle I always used when listening to his donors. I watched a video clip posted by a venture capitalist, and the sound of it made my skin crawl. This woman was speaking to a group of potential investors, and the words coming out of her mouth weren't her own. She was using the exact phrasing, the specific rhythmic cadence, and the niche industry metaphors that I had spent years perfecting for Mark's brand. She was talking about synergistic legacy and the architecture of trust, phrases I had coined in the very library where I now sat. The betrayal was no longer just a matter of the heart. It was a wholesale theft of my identity. This wasn't a simple affair. It was a corporate rebranding where I had been replaced by a younger, more marketable model who was wearing my hard-earned intellectual property like a costume. The deeper I dug into the digital breadcrumbs, the more the staged reality began to unravel. I reached out to an old contact, a soft-spoken event coordinator I had helped with a charity auction years ago under the guise of checking in on the night's success. Through a series of carefully worded messages, the truth leaked out like poison. This woman, whose name was Elena, wasn't being introduced as a girlfriend or even a colleague. Mark had told the inner circle that I was a distant, sickly cousin who lived in the guest house, a woman who suffered from such severe social anxiety that I had consented to remain hidden for my own well-being. He had painted me as a frail, tragic figure who was grateful for his charity effectively erasing my career, my intellect, and our 7-year engagement in one stroke of a silver tongue. He had turned me into a ghost in my own home while I was still breathing, ensuring that if I ever did try to speak up, I would be dismissed as a confused, unstable relative. As the night wore on and the champagne flowed in the photos, a terrifying pattern began to emerge from the archives of my own memory. I began to revisit the last 18 months with a new clinical lens. I remembered the late nights at the office where Mark would return smelling faintly of a perfume I didn't recognize, claiming he had been stuck in a windowless conference room. I recalled the business trips to Zurich and Singapore, where his flight details were always strangely vague, and he would return with a tan that didn't match the local weather. I had given him space out of a deep, abiding respect for his privacy and his ambition. I had believed that a mature relationship meant not hovering, not questioning, and not doubting. But now I realized that every moment of my grace had been a brick he used to build this alternative life. He hadn't been working late. He had been training her. He had been taking the scripts I wrote, the strategies I devised, and the social nuances I taught him, and he had been feeding them to Elena. He was molding her into a public-facing version of me, someone who could parrot my intelligence without possessing the backbone to challenge him. She was a puppet, a beautiful mouthpiece designed to deliver my brain power to the world while he took all the credit. I realized then that Mark didn't want a partner. He wanted a prestige asset that he could control. He had found a way to decouple my talent from my personhood, keeping the talent for his career and discarding the person because I was starting to notice the cracks in his facade. I sat in the dark, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes, and I felt a strange, cold peace settle over me. The man I loved was a fiction, a character I had helped create, and the woman at the gala was merely the understudy. But an understudy only works if they can handle the lead role when the lights get bright, and I knew for a fact that Elena didn't have the depth to handle the storm that was coming. Mark had built a magnificent stage, but he had forgotten that I was the one who wrote the script, and I was about to introduce a plot twist he never saw coming. I realized that his exclusion of me wasn't an insult. It was a tactical necessity. If I were in that room, the illusion would shatter instantly. He needed me gone so he could pretend he was the genius he claimed to be. I looked at the photo of them one last time. The stolen dress, the stolen words, the stolen life. She wasn't replacing me. She was stepping into a role I didn't know existed. The realization that I was merely a placeholder in a staged life was enough to make my blood boil, but as the clock ticked past midnight, a different kind of heat began to radiate from the laptop screen, the cold, digital heat of a smoking gun. I didn't go to bed. I didn't wait for Mark to stumble home with the scent of champagne and deceit on his tuxedo. Instead, I accessed our shared digital vault, a space we had created years ago for our shared future. I had always been the one to organize it, the one who scanned the tax returns and filed the property deeds while Mark focused on the big picture. But as I began to dig beneath the surface of our joint savings and my own personal brokerage accounts, the ground beneath my feet gave way. I found a subfolder buried 3 layers deep within an archived project for a defunct client titled with a generic string of numbers. Inside was a series of high-value bank transfers and corporate filings that made my heart hammer against my ribs. There were wire transfers to offshore entities in the Cayman Islands, suspicious consulting fees paid to companies I had never heard of, and short-term loans with predatory interest rates. But the detail that made the air vanish from the room was the name at the bottom of every single document. It wasn't Mark's name. It wasn't his company's name. It was mine. He hadn't just excluded me from a party. He had used my clean financial history, my immaculate credit score, and my professional reputation as a high-earning consultant to act as a laundromat for his company's gray transactions. I stared at a signature on a loan application for $500,000 a signature that looked remarkably like mine, penned in the fluid, slightly slanted style I'd used since college. I realized with a sickening jolt that he hadn't just been borrowing my brains for his speeches. He had been forging my consent for his crimes. He had used our years of shared trust to gain access to my digital certificates and my private keys, moving money through my accounts like a ghost. To the outside world, and more importantly, to a forensic auditor, I wasn't the victim of a cheating fiancé. I was the mastermind behind a massive embezzlement scheme. Every time I had handed him my laptop to check a quick email or gave him my password to update our shared insurance, I had been handing him the shovel he was using to dig my professional grave. The strategy behind his cruelty finally became crystal clear, and it was far more sinister than a simple midlife crisis or a wandering eye. I was the perfect sacrificial lamb. I had a transparent income, no history of scandals, and a career built on the very idea of integrity. I was the buffer. If his aggressive corner-cutting business tactics ever triggered an internal investigation or a federal audit, the paper trail wouldn't lead to the charismatic senior vice president standing at the Pierre Hotel. It would lead directly to the quiet, hard-working copywriter who lived in his house. He had spent years ensuring I remained behind the curtain not to protect my privacy, but to ensure that when the curtain finally fell, I would be the only one standing on the stage to take the blame. He didn't need me to be his wife. He needed me to be his liability shield. He had curated a narrative of me being a sickly, social anxious recluse to the elite circle, not just to hide Elena, but to explain away why I might be distracted or confused if someone ever asked me about the millions of dollars flowing through my name. In that moment, the heartbreak that had been simmering in my chest for the last few hours vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp survival instinct that was as precise as a diamond-tipped drill. The woman who had spent a decade making Mark look like a hero died in that library, and a woman who knew how to dismantle a narrative took her place. I began a silent, exhaustive audit of every interaction we had ever had. I stayed up until the pre-dawn light began to gray the edges of the curtains, collecting every original draft of the speeches I'd written, every email where he'd asked for my help with a digital signature under the guise of a time-sensitive emergency, and every time-stamped document that proved I was working on copy at the exact moment he claimed I was authorizing bank transfers. I realized that my talent for storytelling, the very skill I had used to build his throne, was now my greatest weapon. I knew how to construct a sequence of events that was impossible to refute. I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to rewrite the ending of his fraudulent script so thoroughly that there wouldn't be a single line left for him to speak. I looked at the mountain of evidence I was beginning to compile, the digital trail of a man who thought he was playing chess while I was just a pawn. He had underestimated the person who had spent 10 years studying his every move, his every cadence, and his every weakness. He thought he could walk away from me and leave me holding the debt of his sins, but he had forgotten that I was the one who held the pen. I moved the files into a secure encrypted drive that he couldn't touch my fingers moving across the keys with a rhythm that felt like a march. The man who was currently sleeping off a night of expensive liquor and stolen glory had no idea that the woman he called the help was currently calculating the exact cost of his betrayal. I wasn't just a jilted fiancé anymore. I was the primary witness for a prosecution he didn't even know was coming. That's when I realized this wasn't about betrayal. It was about liability. The shift from being a victim of identity theft to becoming a corporate whistleblower felt like stepping into a cold, clear stream after being trapped in a smoke-filled room. I knew that a public confrontation would only give Mark the chance to use his charm to paint me as the hysterical, unstable relative he had already told everyone I was. To defeat a man like him, I couldn't use emotion. I had to use the one thing he feared more than anything: the system. I sat at my desk and pulled up the directory for his firm's global headquarters. I didn't look for his boss or his friends in the C-suite. Instead, I found the contact for the head of global compliance and the chief HR officer. Using every bit of my professional expertise as a senior copywriter, I began to draft an email that was a masterpiece of clinical, legally armored prose. I didn't use words like betrayal or cheating. Instead, I expressed a deep, proactive concern regarding recurring clerical irregularities and unauthorized use of personal identifying information in connection with several high-value accounts. I framed the message as if I were a diligent partner trying to protect the firm's integrity from a potential security breach while simultaneously attaching a zip file containing the time-stamped metadata that proved I was miles away from the computer whenever my digital signature was being used. It was a weaponized document phrased so politely that it was impossible to ignore, effectively handing the firm the rope they needed to hang their rising star without me ever having to raise my voice. As the days followed, I watched from the safety of our home, or what was left of it, as the atmosphere around Mark began to shift. He came home the first night after my strike looking confused rather than arrogant. He mentioned a minor technical glitch with his corporate access badge and how his login for the internal server had been temporarily suspended for a routine security update. I nodded sympathetically, even pouring him a drink, playing the role of the supportive, quiet woman he expected me to be while the corporate freeze began to solidify around him. By the third day, the silence from his office became deafening. Partners who usually texted him at all hours with jokes and golf invitations stopped responding. He would sit on the sofa staring at his phone with an expression of growing dread, watching as his outgoing messages remained on read with no reply. Even the proxy, Elena, seemed to sense the temperature drop. In the few photos I caught of them on social media at a mid-week industry mixer, she looked uncomfortable, her forced smile failing to hide the fact that the powerful man she thought she had captured was suddenly being treated like a ghost in his own professional circle. The tension didn't build through shouting or dramatic office scenes. It built through the terrifying bureaucratic silence of an internal investigation that was systematically stripping him of his power. By the end of the week, the panic finally set in, and the man who had told me I wasn't worthy of his world began to realize that his world was shrinking to the size of a jail cell. He tried to reach me first with a sudden jarring burst of charm, bringing home flowers and suggesting a weekend getaway as if the last 10 days of cruelty had never happened. When I didn't respond to his overtures, remaining as cool and distant as a statue, his charm curdled into desperation and then into threats. He cornered me in the hallway, his face flushed and his voice trembling, demanding to know if I had done something to his reputation. He accused me of being vindictive, of trying to ruin him because of a petty misunderstanding about a birthday party. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply looked through him, refusing to engage in the verbal combat he was so desperate for. By remaining a ghost, I stripped him of his greatest weapon, his ability to manipulate my reactions and twist my words. He was used to being the editor of my life, but I had revoked his access to the file. For the first time in our decade-long history, Mark was forced to face the cold, unfeeling machinery of the corporate system without me there to smooth over the cracks or fix his mistakes. In the past, whenever he had overstepped or made a strategic error, I was the one who stayed up until 3 a.m. drafting the apology or the clarification that saved his skin. Now he was drowning in a sea of compliance inquiries and legal questions that he didn't have the intellect to answer on his own. He paced the floors of our house talking to himself, trying to construct a narrative that would save him, but he found that without my brain power to back him up, his lies were thin and riddled with holes. He had spent years devaluing my contribution, convincing himself that he was the genius and I was just the secretary, and now he was discovering the hard way that a puppet cannot survive once the puppeteer lets go of the strings. He looked at me with a mixture of hatred and terror, realizing that the quiet, socially anxious woman he had tried to erase was the only person who could have saved him, and she was the very person who had set the fire. He had built everything, assuming I would stay quiet. The silence that followed my refusal to engage with Mark's threats was the most powerful thing I had ever produced. It was a vacuum that sucked the oxygen right out of his lungs, leaving him to gasp as the professional execution of his career began in earnest. In the high-stakes world of American finance, there are no dramatic handcuffs or shouting matches in the lobby. There is only the cold, agonizing sound of doors locking from the inside. I watched from the sidelines as Mark was officially placed on administrative leave, a move that was blasted through the tightly knit business community like a siren. The big deal he had sacrificed my dignity for the multi-million-dollar partnership that was supposed to be his crowning achievement was abruptly canceled. The partners at his firm weren't fools. The moment they saw the documentation I had provided, they realized he wasn't a visionary, he was a liability. In their world, a lack of compliance isn't just a mistake. It's a terminal diagnosis. I watched his name be scrubbed from the firm's website, as if he had never existed, a digital erasure far more efficient than the social one he had tried to perform on me. He spent his days in our home paced like a caged animal, watching his phone as his professional network evaporated, leaving him with nothing but a shattered reputation and a pile of legal inquiries he couldn't answer. But the most satisfying crack in his house of cards didn't come from a boardroom. It came from the very woman he thought he had used to replace me. Elena, the proxy, who had stood so confidently at his side at the gala, turned out to have a survival instinct that rivaled my own. In a surprising twist of logic that Mark never saw coming, she realized that the same paper trail that led to my door was also being paved toward hers. She wasn't just his lover. She was being set up as the next shield, the secondary buffer for when I was finally discarded. When the compliance officers reached out to her, she didn't protect him. She didn't stay loyal to a man who was already sinking. Instead, she chose to cooperate fully, providing the final missing pieces of communication, emails, and private messages where Mark had explicitly discussed managing me and utilizing my accounts without my knowledge. While we never spoke and would never be friends, Elena and I became the joint architects of his downfall. It was the ultimate irony. The two women he had tried to pit against each other, the old and the new, had become the two pillars that collapsed his ceiling. He had assumed that our competition for his affection would keep us distracted, but he had underestimated the power of two women who realized they were both being viewed as disposable assets. The end came not with a bang, but with a desperate, pathetic whimper. I had already moved most of my things out of the house, staying with a friend while my lawyers finalized the separation of our assets. Mark called me late one evening, his voice ragged and stripped of all the polished bravado I had once admired. He didn't lead with an apology. He led with a plea for help. He tried to appeal to our decade of history, to the love he claimed we still shared, begging me to call the compliance department and tell them it was all a big misunderstanding. He spoke as if we were still a team, as if I were still his ghostwriter waiting in the wings to fix his latest mess. He actually told me that if I loved him, I would fix this, so we could go back to the way things were before that silly birthday party. As I listened to him ramble, I felt a profound sense of detachment. I realized that even now, with his career in ashes and a legal storm looming over him, he still didn't understand what he had done. He saw his crimes as technicalities and his betrayal of me as a lover's spat that could be smoothed over with enough charm. My final power move wasn't a speech or a clever retort. It was the absolute refusal to provide him with a single word of comfort or direction. I let the silence stretch out on the line until the only sound was his heavy, panicked breathing. I realized in that moment that he never actually understood the woman who had built him. He had spent 10 years looking at me and seeing a tool, a resource, a shadow. He had no concept of the person who lived behind the copy, the woman with the iron will and the tactical mind. He thought he was losing a fiancé, but he was actually losing the only brain that had ever made him successful. He begged me one last time to say something to give him a sign that I would help him navigate the investigation. I didn't give him the satisfaction of an explanation. I didn't tell him about the evidence I had secured or the lawyers I had hired to ensure his total ruin. I simply pressed the end call button, severing the last thread of our connection. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had, mostly because I didn't say a word. He was left in a dark house with no one to write his next move, finally forced to live in the reality he had created for himself. He still thought this was about us. The weeks following that final phone call were spent in a whirlwind of strategic precision, far removed from the emotional chaos Mark had expected me to drown in. I worked alongside a specialized team of attorneys to execute what I called the legal cleanse, a systematic clinical decoupling of my identity from every mess he had made. I didn't want his money, and I certainly didn't want to engage in a messy battle over furniture or petty assets. My goal was far more valuable: total disassociation. I provided the forensic evidence that proved my signatures had been forged and my accounts manipulated, ensuring that every shadow of liability was scrubbed from my name. It was a rigorous process of reclaiming my reputation piece by painstaking piece, and with every document signed, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. I walked away from the wreckage with my integrity immaculate and my own finances shielded, proving to myself and to the silent observers in our social circle that my worth had never been a byproduct of his status. My value was and always had been rooted in my own irreplaceable skills and the foresight to protect the woman I was becoming. While Mark's former firm struggled to contain the fallout of his fraud, a quiet tectonic shift was happening in the industry, one that provided the ultimate ironic twist to my journey. The rival firm that eventually stepped in to acquire the assets of Mark's ruined company wasn't a stranger to me. In fact, it was a firm where I had been quietly consulting for years, providing high-level strategy and crisis communication under a discreet LLC. I wasn't just a survivor of the collapse. I was now a stakeholder in the very entity that was swallowing the remains of his failed career. When the acquisition papers were finalized, I sat in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city, realizing that I had done more than just leave his world. I had outgrew it, surpassed it, and then, quite literally, I had helped buy the pieces. There was a profound, quiet satisfaction in knowing that while he was struggling to pay his legal fees, I was helping to steer the ship that had reclaimed his territory. He had tried to keep me behind a curtain to hide his own inadequacies, never realizing that the curtain was the only thing preventing me from seeing that I was already more powerful than he could ever hope to be. Today, my life is a narrative of my own design, a story written in my own voice, and signed with a hand that no one else can claim. I live in a position of peace and immense power, not the kind of power that requires shouting or gala guest lists, but the kind that comes from total self-ownership. I often reflect on the decade I spent shrinking myself meticulously, tailoring my brilliance to fit into the narrow confines of a man's ego. I see it now as a lesson that many women of my caliber have to learn the hard way. We are taught to be the supporting cast in someone else's play, believing that our contribution is only valid if it serves a partnership. But the truth is that a man who asks you to stay in the shadows isn't trying to protect you. He is trying to protect the illusion of his own greatness. He isn't afraid you don't belong in his world. He is terrified that once you step into it, everyone will realize you're the one who should be running it. I stand now as a testament to the fact that our intellect, our loyalty, and our labor are our own to give and our own to revoke. The silence I once used to protect Mark is now the silence of my own sanctuary, a space where my ideas are credited and my presence is never a matter of aesthetic or branding. My story didn't end with a betrayal. It began with the moment I stopped being a ghostwriter for a fraud and started being the author of my own destiny. If you ever find yourself questioning your seat at the table, remember that you are likely the one who built the table, the chairs, and the room they're sitting in. You don't need an invitation to a world that wouldn't exist without your breath. If a man ever tells you that you don't belong in his world, believe him. Then stop financing it. Thank you for following Sam's journey from the shadows of betrayal to the heights of her own reclaimed power. This story serves as a stark reminder that your worth is never defined by someone else's inability to see it, and that the strongest weapon any woman possesses is her own brilliant, independent mind. If this story moved you or reminded you of your own strength, please consider subscribing to our channel and joining our community of resilient viewers. We want to hear from you in the comments below. Did Mark get what he deserved, or was Sam's silent revenge too cold? Have you ever had to dismantle a life you helped build just to save yourself? Your stories and insights are what make this community thrive, and we read every single one. Sharing your perspective helps others realize they aren't alone in their struggles against those who try to diminish them. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new narrative of empowerment and justice. Thank you for watching, for sharing, and for standing in your own light. Remember, the next chapter of your life is waiting for you to write it yourself.